The air in the village of Oakhaven tasted perpetually of damp wool and burning peat. For Elias Thorne, a 23-year-old cooper with hands perpetually scarred by his trade, it felt less like a home and more like a heavy shroud. It was the winter of 1634, and the weight of the old world pressed down on all sides. His father's debts, incurred through a harsh tithe to the local lord, were the immediate, gnawing hunger in their bellies. But a deeper oppression lay in the silence of the village church. Elias had grown up hearing whispered sermons, interpretations of Scripture that diverged from the king's rigid decree. He had seen the fear in his mother's eyes when the parish watch passed their small cottage, their boots crunching ominously on the frozen ground. Twice neighbors had been taken in the night, accused of nonconformity, and never returned. Elias understood then that his life was not his own. It was a carefully curated path laid out by men who ruled from a distant, glittering court. Freedom here was an illusion, tethered by chains of stone and dogma. One frigid evening, while scraping the inner curve of an oak barrel, Elias paused. He looked at the meager stack of coins, not enough to pay the due, barely enough for another week's bread. He thought of his younger sister, Ilara, who dreamt of learning to read, a dream that was treasonous in their current reality. The choice crystallized: stay and wither under the crushing hand of tradition, or risk everything for a myth. He recalled the hushed conversations in the local tavern, stories told by a weathered sailor named Barnaby. Barnaby spoke of a place called Massachusetts Bay, a land where the forest was thick with timber, the soil fertile for the taking, and, most crucially, where men could worship without fear of the pillory. He painted a picture of a harsh, unforgiving coast, yes, but also a limitless horizon. It was a raw, dangerous liberty, but liberty nonetheless. Elias sold the cooperage tools he had inherited, the very instruments of his bondage, and kept only his sturdiest axe. He pressed the few shillings into his mother's hand, a desperate promise in his eyes. "We go now, mother, before the snow melts and the bailiff calls." The choice was agonizing. It meant leaving behind the graves of his grandparents, the only earth his family had ever known. Standing at the edge of the Bristol docks, the sea spray was a shock of cold life against his face. Before him lay the Wanderer, a modest, overburdened ship listing slightly in the murky water. As they climbed the gangplank, the roar of the sea seemed to drown out the whispers of fear and doubt. Elias looked back at the receding shore of England, a silhouette of towering, indifferent structures. The seeds of a reckless journey were sown not out of ambition for gold, but out of a desperate, fundamental yearning for the right to simply exist. He turned his face west, towards a violent, unknown promise, stepping away from the weight that had nearly crushed him. The true trial was about to begin.
The true trial was about to begin. The first week aboard the Wanderer stripped Elias Thorne of his last vestiges of old-world gentility. The ship was a cramped, floating prison, a universe measured in mildewed wood and the ceaseless groaning protest of the hull. The air in the lower decks was a noxious stew of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic stench of vomit. He and the Lara shared a damp, narrow berth with 3 other passengers, their only privacy the woolen blanket they strung up at night. The Atlantic was not the smooth, hopeful avenue Elias had imagined. It was a hungry, churning beast. For days, the ship was hammered by swells that tossed it like a child's toy, reducing the passengers to a miserable, seasick tangle. Ilara, frail from the outset, was barely able to keep down a sip of the foul, murky water, and Elias spent his sleepless nights cradling her, his fear a cold knot in his stomach. The ocean offered no piety, only raw, indiscriminate power. It was during the 4th week that the true trials of the passage began to separate the desperate from the doomed. Fresh water ran perilously low. The ship's master, Captain Davies, a lean man with eyes perpetually squinting against the spray, began rationing, sparking immediate dissent. "We paid for a passage, Captain, not a slow death," shouted a farmer named Thomas, his face gaunt and pale. "You paid for a chance, man, and the sea decides the cost," Davies spat back. Elias watched the scene, his axe, now his most prized possession, heavy under his mattress. He wasn't the loudest voice, but he was a keen observer of the shifting loyalties. He noticed a quiet rivalry forming between Captain Davies, whose authority was brittle, and a hulking, silent man named Silas, a former soldier whose calm presence seemed to draw the most desperate passengers. One night, under a sky that had finally cleared to reveal a cold, indifferent spray of stars, Elias was on deck for his allotted breath of air. He found Barnaby, the sailor whose stories had lured him onto the ship, staring wistfully at the eastern horizon. "The salt-licked horizon takes more than she gives, Cooper," Barnaby muttered, his voice hoarse. "Many turn back in their minds, even if their bodies can't. They cling to the idea of the new world being a softer version of the old." Elias gripped the rail, his knuckles white. "It is not for comfort we sail, Barnaby. It is for the right to choose discomfort." As if to challenge his resolve, a flash of sickly light erupted far to the west. It was not lightning, but the sharp, unnatural flicker of a ship's lantern. Then the distinct, chilling sound of a cannon shot, too close. A rogue English privateer, perhaps, or a Spanish brigantine. They were far south of the intended route. Chaos exploded on the deck. Captain Davies frantically screamed orders, while Silas and his silent followers immediately grabbed tools and whatever rudimentary weapons they could find. Elias didn't hesitate. He knew that for Alara to have a future, this ship had to survive. He pulled his axe, not to fight Silas, but to help secure the loose rigging that threatened to snap in the sudden evasive maneuvers. Across the salt-licked horizon, a new kind of allegiance was being forged, an alliance of the desperate, tested not by shared beliefs, but by the cold, immediate need for survival. The privateer was drawing closer, a dark shadow preparing to consume their chance at a new life.
The anchor of the Wanderer bit into the seabed of a nameless cove with a jarring finality, a sound that signaled both salvation and a terrifying new beginning. After 7 brutal weeks, Elias Thorne's legs, accustomed only to the endless violent sway of the sea, felt rubbery as he stepped onto a beach of gray stones and frozen sand. The smell of land was dizzying, a rich, sharp blend of brine, pine resin, and damp earth. This was the terrifying truth of their destination. Where the map ends was not a blank space, but a vast, silent wilderness waiting to swallow them whole. There were no welcoming jetties, no cleared fields, only a forbidding, towering wall of ancient dense forest that stretched inland as far as the eye could see. The small band of colonists, gaunt and weakened by months of privation, stumbled ashore, dragging their meager, waterlogged belongings. Hilara, frail from the voyage, shivered despite the exertion, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound fear as she gazed at the unyielding, primitive landscape. Captain Davies, his authority restored by the solidity of the earth beneath his feet, pointed toward a shallow incline. A temporary camp before nightfall. The coast offers only exposure. Elias immediately set to work with his axe. The familiar heft of the tool was a comforting weight. He joined Thomas and several others in the arduous task of felling the first great pine, a magnificent tree whose size dwarfed anything they had known in England. Every swing of the axe was a defiance, carving a small, fragile space out of the relentless wilderness. The clash of steel on wood echoed unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The true hardship of these first steps on untamed soil was the profound realization of their isolation. Their European supplies were useless against the alien cold. Their knowledge of farming, learned in manicured English fields, was irrelevant here. Elias knew their survival depended not on their old traditions, but on learning humility and speed. The disputes and rivalries of the voyage, the simmering tension between Davies's rule and Silas's defiance, were momentarily suspended by the immediate threat of cold and starvation. As the sun began to sink, bleeding orange and purple over the vast, darkening forest line, the echoes of the axe swings were answered. From the deep shadows of the woods, a rhythmic rustle broke the quiet, followed by two figures emerging with unnerving stillness. They were native men, tall and clad in deerskin, holding spears tipped with flint. They did not shout or charge. They simply stopped at the edge of the camp's newly established perimeter, watching. The colonists froze. Thomas dropped his saw. Every man and woman instantly recognized the profound shift in power. These were not subjects of a distant king, but the unquestionable lords of this realm. They had witnessed the newcomers' frantic, clumsy attempts at survival, and now stood as quiet judges. Elias instinctively moved to shield Alara, his axe held low but ready. His heart pounded. They had survived the tyranny of the old world and the wrath of the ocean. Now they faced the ultimate test of this new world, which demanded not just courage, but an entirely new way to exist. The true negotiation for their liberty had just begun.
3 years bled into the raw, unforgiving New World landscape, transforming the scattering of desperate refugees into the fledgling community of Newhaven. The campfires of the first winter had given way to sturdy, albeit rough-hewn, timber homes. Elias Thorne, his cooperative skills now vital, had become the settlement's master builder, his scarred hands crafting the very structure of their new life. Alara, though still quiet, was a beacon of resilience, teaching the youngest children to read by firelight, a small, defiant act of freedom. Yet as the physical hardships eased, the old demons of authority returned. Captain Davies, capitalizing on the desperate need for order, had appointed himself governor. He established rigid codes, dictating everything from Sabbath observance to the proper size of a land claim. The very religious liberty they had crossed the ocean for was being suffocated by new, homegrown tyranny. The echoes of rebellion began to stir, not against a distant king, but against the self-appointed monarchy in their midst. The flashpoint was a land dispute. Thomas, the farmer, claimed the fertile riverside plot he had cleared with immense effort, only to have Davies granted to Silas, the former soldier, in exchange for Silas's unwavering loyalty and his role as the new captain of the watch. "We fled the enclosure laws of England to face the same greed here?" Elias demanded in the meeting house, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He stood up to Davies, holding his axe handle, a symbol not just of his trade, but of the property he had literally carved out of the forest. "Our identity is not that of subjects, Governor. We are men and women who earned this soil by sweat and suffering, not by your decree." Davies, seated behind a rough-hewn table, sneered. "Order must be maintained, Thorne. Without discipline, this whole venture collapses into savagery. I hold the charter, and I speak for God's design." Elias stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the assembly, realizing the fight wasn't about the farm, but about forging an identity. "We came here to build a commonwealth, not a kingdom. We need laws that serve the people who toil, not the few who scheme." He reminded them of their shared vulnerability against the forest and the neighboring native tribes. "If we cannot trust one another, how will we ever thrive?" That night, Elias met secretly with Thomas, Alara, and a few others. They drafted a simple document, an agreement based on equality and shared decision-making, a radical concept in a world ruled by birthright. It was a humble step, barely a whisper of the eventual great documents that would define the continent, but it was a revolutionary act nonetheless. By challenging Davies's divine right with the common sense of the settlers, Elias was inadvertently contributing to the unique American spirit. He was learning that liberty was not a gift of the soil, but a constant, necessary struggle against the human tendency to control. The seeds of the New World were taking root, and they bore the thorny fruit of self-governance. The ultimate confrontation with Governor Davies was now inevitable, proving that sometimes the hardest tyranny to overthrow is the one born within one's own community.
The confrontation came not with a roar, but with a frigid silence in the heart of the third winter. Governor Davies, desperate to assert control, ordered the public burning of Elias's written agreement and demanded Elias, Thomas, and several other dissenters be stripped of their land claims. Davies declared their document seditious, a betrayal of the king's and thus God's authority. He had his men, led by a newly promoted Silas, surround the meeting house, weapons drawn. This local struggle for Newhaven was a microcosm of the larger, distant fight that would eventually birth a republic. It was the moment the burgeoning American narrative was being tested. Would they replicate the tyranny they fled, or would they suffer the cost of true self-governance? Elias, standing unarmed before Davies, didn't argue the legalities of the charter. He pointed instead to the simple, cold reality of their survival. "Look at the houses, Governor," Elias said, his voice steady despite the pointed muskets. "Look at the fields Thomas cleared. We are alive not because of your decrees, but because we chose to work together, to rely on one another. Your power is ink on paper. Our agreement is etched in stone, in the foundations of this town and in the graves of those we buried side by side." Silas, standing with his musket trained on Elias, looked past him to the community huddled behind. He saw Elara fearlessly distributing cups of warm broth to the women and children. He saw the faces of the families he had traveled with, the families he had promised to protect from the sea and the wilderness. His eyes fell to the ground, the very soil Elias had argued was earned by sweat, not decree. The silent weight of that shared struggle outweighed the lure of Davies's fleeting authority. In a pivotal moment of courage, Silas slowly lowered his musket. The metallic clang as the butt hit the frozen earth was the only sound. "I came here for liberty, Governor," Silas stated, his voice a low rumble. "And that requires justice for the workers. I stand with the people." The other members of the watch, witnessing Silas's defection and recognizing the undeniable logic of Elias's argument, followed suit. Davies, abandoned and powerless, watched his authority crumble in the face of communal will. He fled Newhaven that night, taking his fragile charter with him, leaving the colonists to govern themselves. Elias's personal journey concluded not with a throne, but with a humble responsibility. He and the others used their agreement, the small, radical document drafted by firelight, as the foundational law for Newhaven. He refused the title of governor, opting instead for selectman, a title emphasizing service and community trust. Years later, an elderly Elias sat watching the great pines fall for the growing town, his hands now tremulous, but his spirit firm. His legacy was not wealth or fame, but the small, thriving town where Elara ran the schoolhouse, and every resident had a voice. He understood then the true cost of a new nation. It wasn't just the blood spilled on distant battlefields, but the everyday courage to discard old habits of deference, to trust one's neighbors, and to build a government on the sacred ground of mutual respect. He had planted a seed of democracy, and it was growing strong.